said earlier, I tried to make the slides very generic enough to give you an overview on how to deploy multi-site. But I realised that if I was attending a slideshow, I kind of want details. So there's a lot of code in there. And as a result, I've actually made the slides available for download, and they'll be made available on the Drupal Camp Atlanta website once we're done. So don't look at it, try and write everything down, because it's too much. What I thought I'd do is, for a demonstration, instead of creating a Craigslist style website, I thought I'd do a Peaches list. And the idea is that the main website will be peacheslist.com, but we'll have subdomains using Atlanta, Paris, Tokyo, and London. The one thing I wanted to try and do is have a single code base. One of the problems when you develop multiple websites is that when you do an upgrade, if you've got 15, 20, 30 websites, that's 15, 20, 30 upgrades you have to do. So deploying a multi-site means you can deploy the code once, and it makes doing upgrades a lot easier. And you can also log it down for each of the different subsites as well. So what I was going to do is, instead of just doing this approach, I'm going to show you 3 or 4 different ways of doing this, and hopefully give you enough information to choose which best fit whichever solution you're going for. Some of the features I want to employ is common login for all the sites. I want to maintain one set of users for all the websites. So if you log into one, you can log into all of them. I want to optimize the websites for high traffic. When you're deploying a multi-site, you end up potentially having quite a large website at the end of the day. And I want to make it easy to deploy new sites as well. The main body of the work is actually done through the sites folder. Basically, when you first set up a website in Drupal, you usually set up a default folder and set up your settings.php, and that's where you do set up your username, your password, maybe hard code some settings like the website name. When you're doing a multi-site, you actually create multiple settings files, and the folder name is actually related to the URL. So in the example we had earlier where we wanted to do london.peacheslist, I created a folder called atlanta.peacheslist and london.peacheslist.com. And that will contain the settings that are specific to each of those sub-websites. Now, Drupal's pretty good. You've got multiple ways you can do things. So some of the other examples I have is you may want to set up your website as a subdomain, which is nice and easy. So it'll be london.peacheslist.com. But maybe you want to do it as a subdirectory. So you have a master website, peacheslist.com /London/Tokyo/Paris. And the difference on that is that you use the same approach, but you're going to change the folder names to match. So if it's a subdirectory, you can see on the top example, it just does a dot and then the name of the folder. If you're using a different port number, then you basically put the port number at the beginning of the directory. And another tip, I put a lot of tips and gotchas in here, because when I was working with a lot of these, some things look very straightforward in the documentation until you deploy them, and then you go through what we call Drupal hell, trying to get things to work. One of the tips, instead of setting the permissions on the directories to be world writable, it's better to actually make the directories ownable by the web server. And it's a different account depending on what type of Linux you're using. If you're using a Ubuntu server, it's www-data. I think on SUSE boxes it's www-run. But if you speak to your hosting provider, they can help you. When you're working on the site, this is just my approach. A lot of times I tend to work locally. So before I deploy it up to my hosting provider, I want to mess with it on my laptop and make sure that all the domains are redirecting correctly. And a good way to do that is to actually check out your host file. And this is quite a good one for any kind of web development. If you're developing a website where you may not have the domain name registered, then you can actually put a fake entry into your host file and it'll trick it out into your local machine. And the beauty of doing it this way is that Drupal will basically assume that those websites exist locally, so you can easily test it. Thing to note with playing with your host file, it doesn't allow wildcards. I can't allow with star.peacheslist and point it to the local drive. So that's the 127.0.0.1. And it can be in a different location depending on which operating system you're on. So if you're a Linux user, it's under etc hosts, Windows NT 2000 in there. and Windows XP goes strong, Windows 7 is the location as well. The gotcha, and I've been hit with this, and it's driven me crazy, is remember to take them out when you're done. Because when you deploy your website live, you make a change to your website, you post a file up, nothing changes. And you don't realize you're actually not looking at the live copy, you're looking at the copy on your laptop. Which I'd like to say is rare, but it's not. I do it all the time. So, always remember to move when you're done. If you have the ability to set up the DNS yourself, and if you buy your domain names on GoDaddy, they do have an option where you can actually go and fine-tune the DNS name posting. A lot of the times it's dependent on where your website's hosted, but a good trick on there is to actually serve the website record to use like an asterisk. Just as we couldn't use an asterisk in the host file, you can in a DNS record. Another advantage of doing this is you can track the traffic where people mistype your website. So if they do www.peacheslist, it will automatically redirect to the website anyway. So that way you kind of minimize the number of forward reports you get.
Can I ask you a question?
Sure.
Will that work on shared hosting, or is this going to change everything assigned to that IP address?
You can do it on shared hosting. The way I've done it before is the usual approach if you buy a domain name from like GoDaddy is that you usually point the name service to wherever your hosting provider is. You don't necessarily have to do that. What you can do is you can actually go into your GoDaddy account and edit the record and specify that only the web addresses get sent to your hosting provider. So as long as your hosting provider, if you're using someone like Bluehost, they'll set it up so that all the www address goes to your website. But on GoDaddy, instead of transferring the name servers over, you can just say, if they come in on this, go there, and Bluehost will pick it up. The trick is don't transfer it over. If you transfer it over to point to the name servers at Bluehost, then you can't make the change. Okay. By me to jump in if there's, otherwise I feel like a little bit self-conscious. Setting up Apache, there's a couple of things to note when you're actually putting a virtual host together. And again, a lot of times this is actually handled by your hosting provider if you're on shared hosting, but I wanted to show you a couple of different options if you maintain your own Apache install. The lines to look at is server alias. Server name, basically, we're using name-based hosting in Apache, so as a request comes in for www.peacheslist, the virtual host tells it the physical directory to go to, and it delivers the web page. Using a server alias, we can actually set a wildcard up to say every variation on this URL goes to the same Drupal site. Drupal will basically handle which website to deliver, but the Apache needs to send all the traffic to that one Drupal install. The other line to look at is the redirect match. Now, there's a couple of guides online where I've seen this, where they say that it's actually doing a redirect when you take this approach, and search engines may not like that. So if you're putting a search engine optimization strategy in place, they'll often say that if it's actually as a redirect, you may get penalized by somebody, say, a spider on Google. So a lot of guides actually recommend using a line in virtual host, which is a redirect match, which basically sets up a 301 code, which to a search engine is often referred to as a permanent redirect. Now, I'm telling you this because I've seen it online. I don't necessarily agree with that. A lot of the times when it goes to a Drupal site, it tends to issue a 200 code, which is a successful website. So if you see it, it'll work with that online.
Simple question, because I'm not really familiar with Apache config files.
Okay.
What is the name of the file that contains that virtual host directory?
Well, when you set up Apache, it's very different on different flavors of Linux, but it tends to be that you can actually create various config files for each website you deal with. So usually there's a virtual host directory. Again, I'm more familiar with Ubuntu. So if you're using Ubuntu server, it's under the etc. Apache directory. You can basically create a site file for each of your websites. We're using name-based hosting, so basically we drive all traffic to Apache, and Apache listens for the incoming request, and then this file tells it where to go to deliver the web page.
Actually, was down on the site, extra,
Yeah, and again, it's different between each flavor. Most versions of Apache will have a tool built in where you can actually create multiple virtual hosts and then switch them on and off as you need. Now this is the hard to read slide. Some alternatives. Just as I did a star dot for Peachy's list, that's really good if you want to make a very generic approach, but sometimes I want to create separate log files for each of the sub-websites in Apache. Mainly if you're using any kind of web stacks, if you throw everything in one location, you're not really, very easy to tell the difference between the traffic between different websites. So I want to split the log files out into various separate log files, so I can fine-tune my installation. So instead of putting everything in one, I can actually split it out over multiple virtual hosts. It gives you a lot more flexibility on fine-tuning each web page. And another example, if you wanted a different approach where you don't want to go london.peacheslist.com or tokyo.peacheslist, but instead you want to go peacheslist/London, you can actually use a directive called alias, and it basically allows you to set up an alias on your virtual host so that when traffic comes in and it does a /London, then Apache will redirect it again back to your main Drupal installation. There is one downside to using this approach. Is everyone familiar with clean URLs in Drupal? Or, well, for those who aren't, I'll just give you a quick run through. There's a great feature in Drupal, which is very search engine friendly, and what it'll do is when you create a post, you can get rid of that nasty question mark, node, with a /node/2110 or whatever. You can just say /about, or /sales, or whatever you want. If you take this approach, it breaks using clean URLs. Drupal will say that it works, but when you actually go and try it, it breaks quite badly. So what you need to do is, inside your htaccess file, you need to add a rewrite rule for each of your websites. I've done an example here for Tokyo. So for each domain that I want to serve it as a subdirectory, you'll need to recreate those lines. Another
question?
Sorry.
When you're doing a multi-site, does each site have its own htaccess, or is there one htaccess for the whole?
It's one for everything. The main way this works is you're really doing one install of Drupal, and you're sending all your traffic to Drupal, and then you're telling Drupal through the settings files which content to deliver. The other approach to doing the alias is to actually use linking. You can actually just link your Drupal install and relink it back on itself as a subdirectory, and that works too. I've done that on a couple of websites. If you do that approach, you still need to do the rewrite, otherwise the clean URLs don't work. Okay, is everyone okay with how that works? I kind of rushed through it, but if anyone's got any questions, just stop me at any point. Well, we've set up the Apache side. The next thing I want to do is I want to set up the database. And one of the things I want to do is I actually want to share certain tables between my websites. And the best example of that is I want to share my user tables. So that if someone creates a user ID on Peachy's list for Atlanta, the same login will work on Tokyo. And also if you log into one, that session will stay open. So you go to any of the other websites and they work as well. So what I plan to do is I'm going to create various databases on the left. The main website for the www.peaches list is at the top one, and then for each sub-website, I'm just using a prefix and then using the subdomain as the name. Now there's a weird one at the bottom. There's a couple of different ways of doing this, and I'm going to go through each of the different scenarios. One of which is to take the fields or the tables the fields out of the tables and move them into their own database table. So for instance, if you want to share users, you need to share these tables inside your database. So what you can do is do an install and then shift all of those into your shared database. This is one approach. I'll show you a couple. I'll give some advantages, disadvantages of each. Now if you do this, there's quite an easy way of doing this in MySQL. If you basically do your prime install on www.peacheslist.com, so it sets up all your database tables, we then want to then pull out all the specific tables that are required for managing the users, and we then want to put them into our Peach shared database table. And you can do that from the command line. MySQL dump, if everyone's familiar, is a way of backing up MySQL databases. You can specifically say, when you back up a database, I want specific tables. So in this example, it pulls out all the fields, all the tables required for users, and puts them into a SQL file, which I can then load in to Pete Shared. So when you go into, we now need to set up a website, so they know that Atlanta, London, Tokyo, they're actually going to share the tables with the other database. So the way you do this is you go into your settings.php file for each sub-website, and you change your database connection to this one down here. Now it's very hard to see in the slide. There's actually a dot at the end of each of those Pete Shared. Pete Shared is the name of the database. You need to make sure that dot is there. And it's mainly so that when Drupal takes the command line and starts to break it out, it will know to go to this database, and then it will pull out the appropriate table. If you don't, it'll just see it as just one word, and it'll fail. So that's the gotcha. You've got to make sure you put the dot in. So that's one approach. The other one that I like to do, mainly because I'm lazy and this works, is when I've set the first website up, I'll just reuse it. So if I've set up www.peacheslist.com and I've set up a database called Peachlist, then instead of using that approach where we pull the tables out and put them into Pete Shared, I'm actually going to tell it to use the database on the first website. So that way it uses those user tables only on the first one. It basically makes the same tables in the sub-sites redundant. They won't get used. But this way, it's all kind of nice and clean. The other reason I like to do this as well is that if you take the other approach, you're making your database distributed, you're spreading it out, and you may run into problems with upgrade scripts. Theoretically, it should work fine if you do an upgrade, but you never know. If you do it this way, you're not physically changing anything in the database. You're just telling it to use the components in another system. This is a tip. I ran across this recently, and I thought this was quite cool. It's kind of unrelated, but I thought I'd share it with you anyway. You're very familiar with the first setup at the top where you want to create a database connection. You can make multiple connections to multiple databases inside a Drupal system. Now the way that's done is, instead of defining DB URL, you can actually break it down into an array. So you can actually set up as default sales. I can create one for Atlanta, Tokyo, and if you're running your own modules, you can easily switch between the databases on each website. You always must remember to set it back to the active when you're finished, otherwise your website will go kind of crazy. Unrelated, but I thought that was cool. So, that's really cool. Here's some of the downsides, or some of the problems you can have. Before, when we started off, we have multiple databases serving multiple content. You have multiple sessions tables, and so as each person hits each website, they're storing all their session data in a database associated with that website. When we start to push everything into one table, serving multiple websites, the tables can get pretty big. The default setting for sessions, and I'll explain a little bit about what sessions are for those unfamiliar with them, but the default session timeout is usually about 2 days. So if you think about 2 days worth of traffic in one table, one website, we've now potentially got 4 websites feeding the same table. So the tables grow quite exponentially. The bigger the tables get, the slower the website can become. So you end up with that death by success, where the website gets a lot of traffic, things start to slow to a crawl. The sessions table is how Drupal basically handles who's logged into which website. As you hit the website, it stores a record in the sessions table, and then when you come back, it just basically does a handshake to confirm who you are. In English, what that means is when you come back to your website tomorrow, you're still logged in. And that's great, but it can get quite problematic when you get very heavy, high volumes of traffic. So the one thing I would normally do is take it down from 2 days, and it's specified in seconds, take it down to about a day. And that way it reduces, every day when the cron job runs, it clears those sessions out. So it'll make the database tables a lot more manageable. If you're adjusting the lifetime for the sessions, it's often recommended that you match the cache as well. So you can actually expire the cache on the connections too. So the two tend to be very related. Yes, the gotcha. They're in different formats. One is minutes, one is seconds. So when you make a difference on one, make sure you have a matching value on the other. A tip, if you're using Subversion or CVS, which is a common tool for maintaining multiple copies of code when you're working on it, instead of making a change to the line, comment it out and just duplicate it. Because then when CVS does a comparison, it still sees the line of code in there. So it doesn't regard it as being changed. And that way it puts your code in as an addition. So it keeps it nice.
Obviously, there's a lot of variability of how much traffic a particular site is getting, how large is your database server. Is there a rule of thumb in order to know how to adjust these? You can run slow query against the MySQL database, or kind of sizing, or you can kind of figure out, well, when it starts thinking about this long in your session database, that you might want to start tacking your session length from 24 hours down to 8 or 12.
One thing you can often find is that maybe one website will be a little bit slower than another. So what you can do, because these are in the settings PHP file, you can actually vary the settings for each website. So if you take the approach where you want to distribute your workload, if London's very quiet, then I might set that to be something where it's a longer timeout period. Whereas if Tokyo is very busy, then I'll shorten it. But it's one of those things that I can't say that there's any way you can really measure that quantifiable change, but I just tend to work on it that if a website starts to slow down, that's one of the things I would check. The bigger the table gets, you do notice the slow down in the website, and that's one of the things I would check. The other thing about taking this approach with putting this data into your settings PHP file is that you can fine-tune it for each website individually. These settings are actually PHP settings. They're not necessarily specific to Drupal. And one of the things that you need to be aware of is that if you put these settings into the htaccess file on the website, if your hosting provider is actually set up Apache using PHP as CGI, then it won't work. It doesn't take those settings. So if Drupal gives you the ability to do that, no matter how it's installed. That's how you put it together. And just to give you a little bit more breakdown, there are more settings you can play with to optimize your installation. And I'll provide some examples. Oh, and I've actually put a note as well. And at the end of this, I'll actually give you some locations, some really good information online. And if you're all looking for that great book that has a lot of this, I've got some recommendations there as well. Some more fun you can have with the settings PHP file. There's actually quite a lot you can do with settings.php. And most of the time we never really do it, because all we ever do is really set the database connection and the URL, and that's pretty much it. But you can go in and actually lock down to quite a high degree each website. So for example, on here when I've got the different protocols, if you're looking at security, it can get quite problematic trying to lock down websites. So what I'll often end up doing is actually disallowing certain protocols. So if I want people to be able to post in any kind of article or a blog post or a page, although I want them to use HTTP or HTTPS links, I can actually block it and set it down to just accept those. But you can see the list at the top, that's the default set of protocols that Drupal accepts. The other thing, you can also lock down the site names as well, and you can also set down the themes. And I will give you this big gotcha, because this took me about 3 days to figure out, and I felt really stupid when I did. You can lock the theme down. So I've got in this example on Peaches List Atlanta, I'm using an Acquia Slate theme. I had a request come in to say that they wanted to change how the forums look. So I went into my code, I edited the style sheet, I popped the style sheet up, and nothing happened. In fact, it was locked down completely. So not only did Drupal prevent you from changing it inside the admin panel when you set it to settings PHP, it wouldn't let me make any code changes to it as well. So you kind of go a little bit crazy on it because you do that. Make the whole website green, post it up, and and nothing happens. So you start to question your sanity a bit, then I realised that I'd locked it down. So there's probably another way of doing it, but I found that just uncommenting the line, or commenting the line out, checking the page, it then forces it to rebuild the theme, and then you can then just go and lock it back down again. But that will drive you mad, because it's just a webmaster's nightmare. There you go. Okay, so the next step is that we've covered basically how to set up Apache, how to set up MySQL. The next thing is that when you create a new website, you always go through a series of installation tasks, which are always tend to be fairly repetitive. So if I'm setting up a community like Apache's list, I might want to go in and say, well, I want to be able to install forums, I want to use aggregator module, I want to turn off blogging, I want to go through and turn off the color module. And it's an automated task that I have to do each time, and it can get very repetitive. And the way you can get around that is actually using a system called installation profiles. Now Drupal comes with a default profile, and it's actually stored under the profiles directory, and funnily enough, it's called default. Who knew? But when you open it up in a text editor, it actually has a wealth of information in the comments. So one of those things where you go through Drupal.org, when you're trying to find information on how to actually do profiles and installation profiles, the best place to look is actually in the default. It's actually got a lot of information in there. So for this example, we've got a subdomain for london.peacheslist.com, and I want to do a subdirectory installation of Drupal again, purely for blogs. And I may want to open this up to writers who are going to write about restaurants in London. So I'm basically going to create another install on top of that install, but I want to limit which features get turned on and off. So when you come to do the install, you end up with a second option. So before, when you go in for a default Drupal install, you get the usual. But because I've created a new profile, it will now come up as a blog profile. And you can have as many of these as you want. If you turn off the default profile or remove it, and you only have one profile, no matter what it's called, Drupal will take that as the default. So if you want to fine-tune, if you're giving some of your users the ability to create their own installs, you might create a sanitized profile file that they can use, which would be a bit different to, say, what your administrators would have access to. So an example of an installation profile, and this is where I start getting into a little bit of code. They're actually very straightforward. The main part of an installation profile, define which modules you want to install. You can actually go into, you can open up the default profile, make a copy of it, and it does give you a lot of the settings and sections that you'd use for your own install, and then you can modify it as you need. But in here, I can actually go in and say, these modules aren't turned on by default, but I'd like these to be employed in my subsite. And it'll do that for you.
Quick question.
Yeah.
These are all default core modules. If you were putting in contributed modules as well,
Works with them too.
it would work with
Yeah.
that.
In fact, with the next part, when you set up your sites folder, you often create like an all folder, and inside there you'll put in your themes and your modules that you want to make available to all your websites. If you put those contributed modules in the modules folder, and it'll be any of those locations, Drupal log folder, then as long as Drupal sees them, when it does the installation, it actually does a requirement check. So a good example would be if you set up CCK, or views, or panels, or any of those kind of modules. If they're available, you could actually include them in that list. And as long as Drupal can see them in those paths, it will install them for you. Some of the additional tasks, installing your modules is only part of the job. Usually there's a little bit extra you need to do. So for this example here, I actually want to turn around and do things like, which slide am I on? Oh, this is terrible, I've got to read my own code. Okay, yeah. Does everyone know that old joke about as a programmer, you have to comment your own code? Because only two people know what you're doing, you and God. And then because 6 months down the line, God only knows because you don't remember. So a good example on here is that I've got some additional tasks that I want to do. So as well as installing various modules, any of the code that you employ for any kind of module development, any of the built-in Drupal code, you can basically employ in your installation tasks. You can make these quite involved. If you use the form hook, you can actually set up custom forms so that when the user installs it, it can prompt them for additional information which will be specific to that website. So for my example, it might be good for things like, which city would you like this to be installed for? And it would basically then update the default settings in that website with that city information. Yes, and the other one is anything that's on the variable table, and this is where I tend to find that if you're at a very low level, but it's quite handy. A lot of your settings in your admin panel are usually stored as variables inside the variable table. And so a very simple hack is variable underscore set. If you have a variable that you want to set at the end of a default installation process, you can include that in your task file. And here's another example, some people in there. I want to set the default theme once it's installed. And that's one of the things that I don't want them to do the installation like with Garmin and Marina at the end. They're very good themes, but I want to specifically have a theme called Apache's list. And so at the end of the installation, I want it to then go and set that theme up at the end of that task. Now the thing with this code snippet, that just turns the theme on. Anyone who's ever implemented theming, you always end up doing additional tasks. You go and turn blocks on, you go and make changes to the theme, and all of that can be done programmatically. So as well as turning the theme on, you can also put your additional tasks in it as well. And most of the time, those variables are stored in the variable table. That's the core of it. The installation profiles can get quite involved, and there's a lot of things you can do, a lot of code. So a couple of places I thought would be worth pointing out. Drupal does have a list of different profiles that other people have written, and I found it very useful when I'm trying to work on my own profiles. So if you go to, I've got the links in here, you can actually pull up multiple examples of profiles. The best place for information is actually in the default profile. Just open it in the text editor, and it's very well documented. It has a lot of options in there which are not employed but are actually commented out. The best book I've seen for guides on installation profiles, and also some of the different installation scenarios, is the Pro Drupal Development book. I find that it's been pretty good. It's got some very practical examples, but it does go into installation profiles in more detail. Okay, and that was it. And I have 5 minutes to go. So does anyone have any questions?
Quick question. You used subdomains and folders.
Yeah.
What about a completely different domain?
Yes, you can do that. Drupal doesn't really care. Well, yes.
Well, you had Peachy's list and Apple's list.
There is a couple ways you can do that. There is one approach you can do in MySQL. If you're using MySQL 5, there's the ability to create a thing called a view. And so what you can end up doing is, instead of going into your settings file, you can actually put the workload onto MySQL. And you create a view of those tables and have that view stored inside your other database. So you've got 2 databases here and here, which are going to take a view of these and make them appear over here. And then that way your settings file stays the same, but MySQL does the work. But I've never employed that. I read some articles on it, but I've never actually done it.
I've done the same exact thing as far as having separate domains, and it works. You can just set up a folder with the domain
Oh, you
name.
can?
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah,
great.
it'll work.
Okay, yeah. There you go. I like those kind of questions when somebody else answers.
In your experience, what's the largest number of subdomains you've used in one database?
I've actually got a website running at the moment which is 30 countries, and we're using a total of 21 languages. So you're looking at about 30 websites, and they're very active as well. So one or two of the countries have got a couple of thousand users, and so
Saying very active, how many?
a couple of thousand posts a day. Very
How many
active.
visitors per month?
Sorry.
Visitors per month?
I think we average about 10 million unique hits across all of them. A lot of the fine tuning came through with printing the session tables out. But when you start to get into those kind of numbers, you start to take other steps as well. One of the other things that's worth looking at, remember I said about the redirect as part of the virtual host? If you look at the forums, the developer forums on Yahoo, or when they were actually spending a lot of time working on improving the performance of Yahoo.com, one of the things they recommended was avoiding using redirects with the 301 because it's classed as another HTTP request. So you're actually reducing your traffic down a little bit.
If you had your scenario where you have multiple countries that want to use it, but you want to let those countries basically do this without you having, more automated, self-driven by the countries.
You can. You end up writing quite extensive installation profiles. The example I've got is with the websites that I'm managing at the moment. We've got 30-odd countries, and we wanted to give the ability for these users to create subdirectories based on products. So the idea that you can go to the Russian website and then we have Geomedia or Smart Plant, Electrical, whatever the product is, and then actually create their own install. So you can actually do that if you look at creating your own modules. If you look at the form book, you can actually create your own forms and actually include them into your installation profile. When you install Drupal, it comes up with a list of tasks on the left. It'll do things like storing database and all that kind of stuff. When you add your own task, it will actually add those as well. So when you look at it, it will come up with installing Drupal, setting up country name, whatever task you put up, it will actually include those in the steps. But installation profiles can get quite involved. Anything you can do in a module, you can do in the installation profile. There you go.
Let's say you have a multi-site with a lot of different websites that aren't really related, you're not sharing the user table. Do you normally set the default website to be if you have a standard, you would set the default to be, or do you not configure it? If people would, or are you able to go out? Yeah, I'm just wondering, how do you prevent, are you using the Apache Wildcard that you mentioned earlier on to make sure that folks aren't accidentally sent to the default install?
No, I tend to actually create a separate vhost file for each website I deal with. And it's only because I want to maybe split out various settings for each of the different websites. You can use a wildcard, but then if you can't find the value, it's going to default to whatever the top website is. So I tend to do that. You don't necessarily have to have them as subdomains, as you said. You can have them as a complete separate URL. The advantage of doing it as a single install Drupal is that when you do upgrades and updates, you're doing it against one code base. You're uploading one set of modules and files, but then you have to go into each website and run the update.php. If you're running at 20, 30, 100 websites, it cuts the work down a huge amount. You can always sort of that at that point. How we doing? Are we all good? That's great. That's my first presentation, ages, so. The slides will be up on the website, and I've actually made them available on my website as well, so if you need to download them. If you have got any questions, just